Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it is my pleasure to welcome to the show Nick Winkelman. Nick is currently the head of athletic performance and science for the Irish Rugby Football Union, and his primary role is to oversee the delivery and development of strength and conditioning and sports science across all national and provincial teams. Nick is also the author of the book, The Language of Coaching, The Art and Science of Teaching Movement Skills, published by Human Kinetics. Well, Nick, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to join us today.
Chris, it's an absolute honor, and I can say that I've never had the opportunity to connect what I do to those that work in law enforcement. So I'm really excited to have this conversation and the opportunity to support an amazing community.
Well, thank you. And now that was a very short bio that I read about you. And obviously, Nick, you have an extremely extensive background and coaching movement skills in a variety of domains. So why don't you spend a few minutes just introducing yourself to our audience and tell us about your journey and how it is that you ended up with a specific passion for language and the intersection of coaching language with motor learning?
Yeah, I'd have to imagine, Chris, your population listening to this be like, how is a strength and conditioning coach talking about motor learning, let alone the kind of motor learning that can help us with what we do? So it, like most things in life, it hasn't been a straight line, but I'll try to keep it short. Basically, I've been in human performance strength and conditioning now for just over 20 years. Okay, I'd say that my life has been broken up into kind of two professional chapters so far. The first 10 years of that was working in the United States at a place called Athletes Performance. Now it's called Exos, which basically was a private high performance center that catered to professional athletes of all varieties. But I think of relevance here is it also catered to elite military. And so what I would do in that space specifically was, primarily helping college students who were going into the NFL Combine draft process prepare for that. And so as a strength and conditioning coach, very much so, I would bring those players in, have them for 8 weeks, travel with them to Indianapolis, and ultimately help them perform as best they can, as we like to say, in the biggest interview of their life. So I spent about 8 of my 10 years at Exos leading that program. The other thing that I did while I was there was oversee our coach education department. And within our coach education department, the U.S. military took a huge interest in actually putting greater energy and effort to upskilling command leadership around effective training practices. So they looked to professional sport and sport at large on how athletes take care of their bodies and how they ultimately could, I think the initiative was referred to at the time, humans are more important than hardware, actually invest back into the human capital. So I spent a lot of time both in our performance facilities as well as on various bases around the United States, running 5 to 6 day, what we refer to as mentorship courses, going through mindset, movement, nutrition, recovery, and applying these best practices and how to take care and develop your body. Inevitably, I had the opportunity to come over to Ireland in 2016 and take on a role very much so specific in the sport of rugby, as you said, as the head of athletic performance and science. And our structure, and it's a common enough structure in rugby, is where we have the national governing body, IRFU, which is on my shirt here, Irish Rugby Football Union, which has oversight across our 4 professional rugby teams. So it'd be as if, the NFL had oversight over the 32 teams or the NBA over the respective NBA franchises. Same thing goes here. And so my responsibility is to work across roughly 45 strength and conditioning and sports science staff members that make up 4 professional rugby teams and ultimately our national rugby teams. And so very much so my day job right now, Chris, is in the human performance, living and breathing, the development of athletes to play this great game that we tend to love world over, but isn't necessarily the most popular in the United States. And so the question still is, well, Nick, where the heck is this language of coaching thing coming in? And so for me, that the short answer to that is I have always had a love of coaching and a love of coaching movement. And in my early years, when I started to oversee the NFL Combine Development Program, I found myself leaving the gym. And actually, I spent most of my time on the field or on the pitch, as we say in Europe. And that's where I was working on sprinting, agility, change of direction, and more, let's say, the technical skills that we see expressed through movement on the field of play. And so as I found myself getting closer to teaching what you might call complex movements that have a huge dependency, as your population does, on decision making, it just inevitably brought me face to face with my own coaching practice. I can't tell you why, Chris. I just always had this strong orientation towards myself as a variable. And I was always very reflective on how my coaching impacted these individuals. And I found myself probably, I think it was in early 2000, somewhere between 2007 and 2009, being overwhelmed by this sense that there was something missing. And I started to ask questions to my colleagues, like, how do you get better at coaching? And they kind of gave me this puzzled look because, like, well, you are a coach, you're one of our, what do you mean? How do you just, you get better? I'm like, no, but how do you actually get better at the act of coaching? And what was interesting, I was like, what books would you read? And people started mentioning all these books. But Chris, the books were on program design and periodization. And in kind of sports culture, that's basically what you're going to do. What drills are you going to do? How much weight are you going to lift? How are you going to organize it across a day, across a week? And I'm like, no, 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 no. That's what we're going to do. I'm talking about how we do it. Like literally, I talk to athletes all day long. Surely, surely what I say, how I say it, when I say it, surely that must have some impact on learning. Otherwise, people could just go out without coaches, play the sport, and that would be enough for them just to exponentially get better. And we know, sure, that's the case when someone's young, but inevitably there's a ceiling. And otherwise, there would not be an industry that employs coaches across all these various areas to help people break past those. And so ultimately, what I found was there was a gap, and I started to go on a search myself. And I found myself reading educational psychology books. And as you rightly said earlier, motor learning, motor control, basically the science of how we learn to move, skill acquisition, and the like. And I ultimately found that, yes, there is a curriculum, there is areas, pockets of science that have something to say about the things we say and the impact that language has on the way we learn. And so ultimately over time, I just started to become in contact with these materials. I started to bring them life through my own coaching and inevitably pursued a PhD and ultimately felt compelled to write a book on the topic because I didn't want to look forward into the next generation, the future Nicks and Chris's and whoever's who are now facing the same question and the same internal voice saying there must be more. I wanted them to have something they could go to. And ultimately, that's how I found myself kind of occupying this space. And it's a space that's allowed me to speak to a lot more people than just strength coaches, because what you and I are going to talk about today is movement. And it doesn't matter what that movement is, the way a coach or a trainer or whatever preferred title they occupy, the way we communicate has a huge bearing on how that person learns, understands, and applies that skill in the real world.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I love what you said there earlier about, and this is in your book as well, which was just so impactful for me, is really 4 questions that me as a law enforcement trainer teaching, whether that's combatives or firearms training. And I think it's one thing. So just, as an example for you, Nick, because you may not be overly familiar with the law enforcement motor learning environment, but for example, in combatives or firearms training, what you will typically see is it's very often very linear, very technique focused. You have your students lined up in a line, and then the coach or the trainer is very focused on biomechanics, on movement, on the technique part of it. And I found myself reading for your book being there were many pain points for me in there because I saw myself as basically the contradistinction of what a good coach should be in so many ways. But I love what you said there about, those questions. Should I say something? When should I say it? What should I say? And how should I say it? Man, I think that those four questions and really that's the foundation for your entire book. So why don't you walk us through, give us maybe, I don't know, an example, a thought experiment or something like that, as far as the language and the intersection between language and coaching.
Yeah. So I'm really glad, Chris, you asked for a thought experiment. You may have heard some of my other podcasts. I have a sneaky suspicion. So let's
Yeah,
do
right.
just
Oh,
that. I found over the years, you're dead right. I think it's valuable to let someone kind of experience the principle, and then we can start to unpack how that principle can come to life. Before we do that, though, I think you said something really valuable, and it is the way I like to characterize the work. I'm going to try not to say my work. I see myself as a conduit with which to express the work of many others in a focused area. But what you said is dead on, and that is what we are doing is looking at the space between, or the intersection between, what a coach says, what an athlete or individual hears, and ultimately how they can apply that to the movement they're trying to learn. And so the question is, what can we fill that space with to drive learning? And here we're using the term learning, and we're going to say it a lot, Chris, so we probably should define it. For me, learning is the ability for, in my case, an athlete to express a change without reminder, prompt, or feedback in a relevant context, which means to say, when they came to me, they had an ability level of X. And when they left, they have an ability level of Y. And that ability level Y is retained by them. It doesn't require the continued presence or the continued reminders or feedback. Now, it doesn't mean that early on I didn't have to give them a lot of feedback and instruction, surely, but inevitably my coaching practice leads them to be able to own something, to quite literally walk away better than when they came in. And for those that are students of sport, they maybe have heard the quote that was made famous by John Wooden: "I have not taught until they have learned." For me, when people say, "What's your coaching philosophy?" That's what I'd say if I had to put it in one sentence. Because if ultimately I am constantly calibrated to observing my athletes in context demonstrate something we work on of their own accord without reminder, prompt, or feedback, that is the best demonstration that they have what I like to say OTC'd, own the change. And that's what we're about, owning the change. And so how does language impact that? So let's demonstrate it. So given that I don't work with firearms or close combatives, hopefully I can be forgiven that won't be the thought experiment or the example I will use. However, I'm going to try to use very generic movement examples that everybody probably can relate to. And so for this one, I'm simply going to use an example of sprinting, of running fast from a dead start, if you would. So I want everyone to imagine they're, let's say, in Vegas. Okay. And you walk up, let's say you're in the MGM Grand, and you see this big old sign that says, let's make a bet. You're intrigued by it. You walk in, and to your right, you see a track set up. And to the left, you see just an attendant at a booth. And you walk up to the attendant and you say, "What's this about?" And they're like, "Oh, it's very, very simple. We're going to give you this card. On this card are cues. You might call it a cue card. There are going to be 3 different cues. These are the things that you can think about while you are running 10 meters as fast as you can." And you're nodding, like, okay. So I read these 3 cues. Exactly. So you're going to read each of these cues, and you are going to run 3 10-meter efforts thinking each of these thoughts, 1 10-meter effort for each thought. And all we want you to do is make a bet. Make a bet on which of these cues, which of these mindsets you think is going to allow you to run the fastest 10-meter time. And we can assume in some mystical biological magic that we ensure that you're focusing on this, that we have accurate timing, there's no fatigue. All of that in this thought experiment is controlled. And so all you need to do as the recipient is make the bet on which cue you think would allow you to go from 0 to 10 meters as fast as you're capable of. And so the cues are as follows, Chris. Cue number one, you read it, it says, focus on rapidly extending your knees. So you're thinking, okay, so you kind of close your eyes. Okay, you imagine you're on a starting line. Okay, focus on rapidly extending my knees. And you kind of run that through your simulator and you have a sense of what that would do for you. Okay, and then you say, okay, I got that. And you read the next cue. Focus on rapidly pushing the ground away. Your first instinct is, okay, those are kind of similar. But then when you close your eyes and feel yourself through your mind apply the cue, you're like, you focus on rapidly pushing the ground away. Okay. Now, already you likely have made a bet, and I'd say it's unavoidable. You didn't think of the answer, you felt the answer. And I want to draw the listener to that distinction because we'll probably talk about it again later on. And you're, okay, there's a third cue, so let me read this. And its wording is slightly different, and you read as follows, okay? Imagine there is a rattlesnake just behind you. Beat the bite. Beat the bite, it repeats. And you're like, okay, so that gave you a certain response and maybe one of a bit more immediacy even than the other two. And so you're now ready. Your bet is made. And I'd say the bet is made without you having to think of it. So for you, Chris, if you're that person, which one do you choose in your mind to focus on to allow you to run the fastest 10-meter time?
Well, without a doubt, the last one with the rattlesnake.
Okay,
I mean, I think
good.
my heart rate increased just imagining that. So there was emotion involved in that one for sure.
There is emotion, yes. Now, if I got rid of that one, if I got rid of C, and I just gave you the A and the B option to remind you and the listeners, rapidly extend your knees versus rapidly push the ground away or push the ground back, which of those would you have selected naturally?
Oh, push the ground away for sure.
Okay. So what we find is in unpublished research, myself and some colleagues who, by my own accord, need to publish, would find that when you take both athletes and non-athletes, or even in my own experience of walking many audiences through that thought experiment, you rarely find individuals that don't answer in the exact same way. And we could come up with 100 different versions of that same thought experiment in different contexts and different movements. And ultimately, what you tend to find is people gravitate towards this third type of cue. And so what's going on in that third cue that is different than the other two? You used a really important word. You used the word emotion. So it naturally leaves us with emotion. Part of the reason it leaves us with emotion is it leaves us with the emotion of fear. Many people naturally have a fear of snakes, especially venomous snakes. And one of the reasons that is such a potent cue is because it is highly visual. And it's what we refer to as an analogy. Because obviously there's not literally a snake behind you. It's, I want you to move as if there was a rattlesnake behind you. And I give you a bit of language to boost that and saying, beat the bite, adding to the emotion a bit of memorable alliteration. So I'm using alliteration and analogy together to heighten the emotion, right? The visual, as well as the overall memorability of it. And so when you take something like an analogy, which is taking something someone is familiar with, and you're applying it to a movement or a situation they're not familiar with, you are able to, if you would, transfer that familiarity to this new thing, making this new thing not feel so novel. And that's why we tend to find that people will gravitate towards analogies, which are nothing more than small miniature stories, if you would, as a primary mechanism of learning movement skills. You and I can talk in a bit on how we do that. Following on from there, we then see, well, what's the difference between the QB, which was focus on pushing the ground away, and QA, which was rapidly extending your knees? Well, if you think about it, in the second cue, we're asking you to not think about your body, but think about the outcome your body is trying to achieve. If you think of all of your joints and your muscles like a symphony, right? You have the percussion, you have the flutes, you have the air, whatever. I'm not much into music here in that regard, but you have all the different elements of an orchestra. That's very much so analogous to all the different muscles and joints in your body. But for an orchestra to truly play brilliantly as one, what does it need? It needs a conductor. And so ultimately that external cue brings a oneness to the movement. It takes all the different moving parts and it orients it to a single purpose. that is outside of the body. And that's what we refer to as an external cue. And it's important to note that the cue has to be outside of the body, because if I reference anything inside of the body, I'm drawing attention towards one feature of the body, let's say the knees, right, at the expense of some other part of the body, let's say the hips or the arms or the trunk, which then obviously leads us to the first cue we gave, which is if the second's an external cue, the opposite of that is an internal cue, where I draw you to just one specific biomechanical flavor or feature of the movement. And so it's important to say this: naturalistically, we tend to find analogies and external cues not only more interesting, but if we go to the evidence, Chris, which I know you're familiar with, is we also find that those types of cues quite objectively lead to better immediate performance in the moment, but also better learning long term, which means that the athlete is retaining this. They can continue to express the change without reminder, prompt, or feedback. And so what I love about this is both analogies and external cues are naturalistically, humanistically, right, more in tune with something about us and how we learn and how we orient and move around in the world. But also there's evidence to back that up. The question then ultimately becomes like, hold on, where then is the space? Where then is there the room to talk about the body? I mean, you yourself, Chris, say in your own domain of coaching, close combat and firearms, there's a lot of emphasis on biomechanics. There's likely a lot of emphasis on body position, which means you're talking about the body. So
Right.
Nick, Chris, if I'm your audience, Nick, Chris, are you saying we can't or shouldn't do that? And let me just get it out up front. We are not saying that. This is going to be a conversation about an and, not an or. An and, not an or. The reality is biomechanical, technical, internal language serves an incredibly important purpose. But the reality is it's the start of a story. It's not the end of a story. To truly have a rounded way of coaching, we need to have a way to describe what needs to change. Your elbow needs to go here. Your wrist needs to go here. Your shoulder needs to go here. Absolutely. We need a mechanism to share that information. But then we need a mechanism with which to bring it all together. We need a conductor that can take all of those different parts and put them into one thought that is low in mental pollution, high in clarity, and allows me to be accurate in technical expertise, but still able to make decisions real time, which seems highly relevant in the world that your group works within. And that's where we find this relationship between internal cues and external cues. And there's a lot more we can say there, but I'll pause and get your comment, Chris.
Yeah, no, I that's so helpful, Nick. I mean, because I think, when we think of law enforcement, like we have the learning domain, the training domain, and then we have the criterion environment out in the field where those skills hopefully will be retained and transferred into that real world. But part of the problem, I think, is we have such a linear, closed training environment where a lot of our instruction is that very internal based type of language that sends our people's attention internally focused, like you said, but out in the real world, that is the last place we want their attention. We want their attention to be externally focused on the rapidly changing dynamic environment that's happening, because they have to be adaptable, read what's happening, and make those fast decisions. So I think what we have right now is a big disparity between what that operational environment looks like and what the learning environment looks like. So how does a trainer know if there's a place then for that internal language about the body and the biomechanics? Where does that start and where does it end? Like, where should a trainer understanding be like, okay, I need to start getting my learner out of an internal focus. I need to wean myself off of that internal focus language and get my student in an external focus of attention.
So I want to be really clear. There is no formula here, Chris, and I'd be misleading you and your audience to say there is.
Right.
There are principles that I think the longer you use them, the more obvious it becomes when you need to use them. But when I was starting out, I made I made a lot of mistakes. And the first thing to say is, to the degree that when you're in a safe environment in what you're doing, those mistakes can be made, fantastic. But ultimately what we're going to try to do here is give a framework, but one that is flexible. So I
Okay.
like to say, what I try to put forth in my book and when I'm talking about talking is flexibility within construct. Flexibility within construct, because every person is different. And so we need to have a way to be flexible around how those differences play out and the way we need to coach them. And so one of the models or the constructs I use, I talk about it in the book, is what I refer to as the coaching communication loop. Okay, the CCL, coaching communication loop. And I think this is uniformly useful to anybody coaching movement. I don't care if it's surgical skills, firearm skills, or teaching someone to sprint or throw a baseball. Okay. And it goes something like this. It's referred to as, the acronym would be DDCDD. Okay. So there's 5, if you would, components to it. And I refer to it as a loop because the components loop back on one another. And so it's a feedback loop, quite literally. And that feedback loop is to help ensure you're saying the right thing in the right way at the right time to drive immediate kind of aha, but an immediate aha that cashes out as their ability to own the change. And so we have a long loop and a short loop. So I'm going to start by explaining the long loop, and in doing so, it'll explain the short loop. And so the first D is referred to as describe it. Okay. And the second D is demonstrate it. So describe it and demonstrate. What that is doing is it's establishing a basic grounded level of understanding of, this is what we want you to do. It's general instructions. Okay. It is decreasing anxiety by saying, this is what you can expect. Or there's different ways we could articulate this. So the description, Chris, for me, is the domain of internal language. It's like, hey, we're going to be working on this specific activity. This is the body position we're looking for. These are the critical components of that body position. Now we're going to demonstrate it. We demonstrate it. You can see in my demonstration, this is critical body position A, B, C, right? It depends on the complexity of the movement. But basically, you're giving them a verbal and a visual representation of the movement. I still think that brevity is your best friend, to say the most with the least, to recognize that in any given moment, it is not possible to impart all the information you may want to. And so if you flood the funnel of attention, you ultimately get nothing through. Or the best case is some things get through, but you have no idea what got through across the various cohort of people in front of you. And so if brevity is our best friend, we think of learning as iterative, and we try to build it piece by piece. We put the pieces we feel are most relevant today verbally through a description and visually through a demonstration. Now, you might have some instructors listening to this say, well, hold on, could I even just demonstrate and give no verbal instruction at first and have them do nothing more than mirror me? Absolutely, you can. If you say, hey, I'm going to demonstrate the activity, I want you just to take notice of my body position and my orientation, and then I'm going to give you a chance to mirror me in a moment. That's absolutely okay. What you're trying to do is you're trying to give them the minimal level of information needed to get them going. Because it's like going to the grocery with a very long grocery list. If I say, hey, I need you to pick up milk, you get to the grocery store, you're going to remember the milk. But if I give you 10 different things to remember, you're probably going to get most of them, but there's probably pretty good chances you're going to forget a few things. That's kind of the way I think of the description and the demonstration. You want it to be a very short grocery list, okay? Just a few top line things. So we describe it, we demonstrate it. Now, the third component is then we cue it. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, Nick, if you're describing something, you've already offered language about the movement. Why then do you have another thing of language called the cue? And so for me, the cue it's the single idea. It's the short, brief phrase that is meant to be the guiding lens, the guiding focus point they use while they perform the movement. To borrow from the analogy already given, it's the conductor. The cue is the conductor. The description is all the different components of the symphony, as many as you feel you need to talk about. But the cue is the conductor, brings it all back into its oneness. Ultimately, then, after you cue it, they do it. They have to perform the action, and that's where the learning, that's the arena where the learning really takes place. And then finally, you debrief it. The debrief, Chris, is meant to achieve one of three things. And here I'm talking about, you can debrief a lot of different factors in learning, but here we're talking about the debrief in relation to this coaching dynamic. My goal is to figure out, do I repeat the cue? Why would I repeat it? Because it worked. Okay. Do I refine the cue? I refine it means the message was correct, but the way I phrased it, the way I oriented it maybe wasn't quite correct. So for example, I might say, hey, I want you to think about pushing off the ground in that sprinting example. And maybe I saw them do it, but it didn't quite have the explosiveness I want. So the next time I say, hey, okay, instead of pushing off the ground, I need you to explode off the ground. So I simply upgrade the verb. I put a little bit more action in the action, if you would, in the language I offer. That's what I mean by refining it. I don't throw it out. Or I retire the cue. I retire the cue if it did not work or if it potentially had a negative consequence. And so once I've done that, now guess what? I have my next cue loaded up, ready to go. And so the long loop, describe, demonstrate, cue, do, debrief, is when I'm teaching something for the first time, or I'm seeking to make a broader reminder on certain features. But then the short loop, cue, do, debrief, that is when I'm instructing or teaching something for which the person is already familiar. And that's the loop I go through again and again and again. Now, if I'm listening to this, you might say, well, Nick, do you need to provide a cue every single time? As you know, Chris, the answer to that is categorically no. You need to provide breathing room, as I call them, silent sets, to allow them to apply, to explore, to figure things out for themselves. But at some point, you are going to cue. At some point, they are going to do. And at some point, you are likely going to debrief to capture and preserve the learning and the shared understanding. So the next set, the next rep, the next day, the next week, you can pick up where you left off. And I call this red thread coaching, as in pulling a red thread. We want the commonality to end with the session just gone and picked up on the session forthcoming. And I use this process not only to drive what I do within sessions, but across sessions. And it creates cohesiveness and a singular learning narrative for the person. So often coaches will coach different things on different days in a very reactive way versus starting to develop a mental model of what's their movement pattern, what's their common error, what are the common cues or drills, I should say, and drills I'm using to combat them, to change them. And how am I systematically iterating that across time to support the outcome observation of them learning, owning the change without reminder, prompt, or feedback? And Chris, you can cash that check at any bank because that is a process that you can just continue to grind and grind and grind because each of those components have the flexibility to use different kinds of language, different flavors of analogy, different frequencies of cueing, different intonations and how you deliver the cue. All that flexibility exists within that construct.
Perfect. And a question on the timing of the cue as I'm listening to you talk, like one of the things that I think I at least am beginning to understand that I didn't for so long in my training and coaching is the importance of allowing your students to struggle through mistake and error, those desirable difficulties. And what I was prone to doing, Nick, was when I saw my students struggling and making mistakes, is I would very quickly step in to provide some type of feedback. And so when you're talking about those times of silence to allow your performers just to do the move or to solve the problem, like how should a coach understand the importance of that struggle, those mistakes, those errors? And then when is the error to a point where, no, I need to step in and provide a cue to help my student?
Yeah, this is it's a fantastic question, Chris, and it's one that doesn't come with necessarily a straightforward answer. But I do think there's some things we can provide here to help someone get to that answer. So when I see someone struggling, I kind of put it on a continuum, right? On the far right side of that continuum, let's say we might have someone that is doing something that is detrimental to themselves, meaning it could cause immediate danger to their safety. I'm sure there's probably situations where that happens in your line of work. And
Absolutely.
albeit less often, there are certainly situations when we're lifting weights, when we're doing, let's say, tackle technique, when we're running, where you could see someone. So in that case, when I see someone who appears to be in proximity to danger, endangering themselves, that's a point where I feel, okay, I want to provide some level of feedback, some level of cueing here. And just to pick up on that word, because people might say, well, Nick, and Chris, what's the difference between a feedback and a cue? In a lot of ways, when we're talking about language anchored to movement learning, which is what we're talking about here, a cue is both feedback and instruction, in that the cue I'm giving is referencing what was just done and is hopefully meant to help you improve upon it in the subsequent rep. And so for me, the glue between the bricks, if you would, is the cue. It's the mortar in this regard. So we may use the term feedback and cue synonymously in this conversation, just to say that for the audience. So if someone's an immediate danger to themselves, physically or otherwise, then a cue probably makes a whole lot of sense. When I see someone in that, you talked about desirable difficulty, which is a term that is often used, or another phrase I like here is strategic struggle. So the question you have to ask yourself as the instructor, and I can't give a black and white answer to this, is, are they generally getting the concept of what the description and what the cue is asking them to play around with? And so the way I think about it is this. If you've ever had, I have two kiddos, when my son or daughter were young, what's one of the things that they love doing? They love going up to like a light switch, right? And flicking it on and off as fast as they can. And you're like, oh, you're going to burn out the bulb. It's not a disco party, right? That's if you would, a metaphor for strategic struggle, in that you're seeing from moment to moment, they're starting to get it and then they're slipping out of it. They're starting to get it, then they're slipping out of it. It's kind of the lights coming on, the lights going off, the lights coming on, the lights going off. Now, you as the instructor, you're going to have a better idea of what good looks like and what bad looks like, or where they were when the session started and where you want them to end. And if it looks like they are literally exploring beyond the pattern they came in with, beyond the normal movement they came in with, for me, that's kind of the space of strategic struggle. Once you see that the light is off and they're just making the same error, Chris, over and over again, and you're seeing no flicker, for me, that's a pretty good bit of evidence to say, okay, they've kind of maybe they've improved, but they've met their capacity of learning. That the cue, so to speak, is like a sparkler. It's run to the bottom of it. I need to light a new sparkler here. I need a new spark. I need a new idea to continue the learning process. Or you may say, hey, it's the end of a session. They're tired. They're mentally fatigued. Their capacity to pay attention for whatever reason, because we've gone through something very attentionally demanding, is low now. This isn't the time. We're going to leave things as they are, and we'll pick it up in the next session. So you also have to factor in, not only is their learning stage, is their level of struggle suggesting a cue is beneficial or not, but do they have the capacity to actually do anything with that cue? I'll give you another way that shows up. When I have an athlete arrive, if they seem very, not irritable in that they're aggressive, but they feel that they seem very irritated, very frustrated. They don't have a lot of attentional capacity to be dedicated to any one thing. Maybe I see it in their verbals and their nonverbals. For me, that's an individual that is not probably showing up in a very coachable mood. And so I like to talk about the concept of people's learning moods. You hear people talk about learning styles. I think there's also an idea of a learning mood. We've all had that, where we're in a great space to take on information and learn, and we've all had it when we're not. So go no farther than yourself as an N of one to know this concept of a learning mood kind of exists in you. And so that's another factor, Chris, is, are they even in a good space today to take on information and apply it? On days or in moments where the answer to that question is no, or at the very least probably not, then that's maybe where you take a more action-oriented approach. So today's about repetition, it's about rhythm, it's about activity, it's about getting reps in and letting them feel their way through the session with light guidance. And on days where they seem very open, mentally alert, ready to go, that's maybe where we spend a little bit more time trying to get in the cues, collaborate on the ideas that are going to unlock the next level of their technique or their precision. And this is the dance. This is the dance when it comes to coach and athlete, instructor, instructee.
That's great, and I'm interested though. What is the role, in your opinion, of the coach in helping to create that learning mood? Because I know law enforcement trainers listening to this are going to be going. They have a classroom or a mat room or a range full of hostages that
Yep.
they're there because they're told they want to come there, and there's always in that bell curve. Nick, there's the whole range of learners. There's the ones that
Mm.
are open and willing to learn. There's the ones on the right end that they train all the time. They're just fired up. They're highly motivated. And then we have those other group that are they come to learning or to a training event with a low level of motivation. And so is there a role for the coach when you talk about the first D in the loop, the describe it? Is there a role there that we play as coaches to set the stage, to tell the why, to try to get our students motivated and engaged in the learning?
Well, absolutely. And at the end of the day, you cannot force someone to want to learn.
Right.
I think it's like I used to try to force an answer to a question like that, Chris, and I'm just not going to do it. And can we create conditions that lower the barrier to learning by, for example, making things more interesting, more engaging, more attractive? Absolutely, we can. But the best will in the world, they still have to show up to the party, and even in saying that, it's not like you wake up and say, what am I going to be motivated by today? Oftentimes we put too much internal causation on motivation with individuals. At times, no one chooses not to be motivated. We are very much so the audience of our motivation. The best we can ever do is identify, hey, this isn't motivating to me. So what might I be able to do to change the conditions of that? Part of that is what the coach brings, and part of that is what the athlete or what the instructee brings. So just to give that as a little bit of a background, because again, I don't think you and I are here going to suggest for a second that we have any, any kind of magical pixie dust that rectifies all this with all people. It's just simply not going to be the case. But ultimately, the way I approach it is, and you might be pointing to this, I talk about this in the book, is kind of what I refer to within that description, within that pre-session brief, is the WWH. What are we doing today? Why are we doing it? And how are we going to do it? The what is very standard. It's quite literally, hey, we are working on these skills, these techniques, whatever it might be. Okay. And what it does is it reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty and anxiety, Chris, are corrosive to attention and learning.
Mm.
If I have high levels of uncertainty and anxiety, that is, anyone who's ever felt uncertain, overwhelmed, or anxious knows that it's hard to think about anything else when you're in that state of mind. And I can only imagine, possibly in the line of work you and those listening are in, because of it, you may find people in that state of mind. So, how from the very beginning can we reduce the anxiety, the uncertainty by increasing clarity of expectation?
Mm.
Right. So one time I heard anxiety described as the space between what I feel I'm capable of and what is being asked of me. And the wider the space between what I feel I'm capable of and what's being asked of me, the more anxious or uncertain I might be. So how do we close that space? How do we set clear expectations? Here's what we're going to do today. The why then is very simple. Why is this important? I would imagine in many cases, Chris, with what you teach, the why is quite obvious. Right? It's life saving, either saving another person's life or saving one's own life. And so I find that the why, oftentimes these things can be I might be making a poor assumption here, but that's available to you in spades. Where sometimes in sport, there's a lot on the line, but it's different things that are on the line in our case. So we have to make a strong why, especially when I have a rugby player who I'm trying to get them to lift weights. And maybe that's a bad example because rugby and NFL athletes like to lift weights by and large. But if I'm working with a soccer player or an NBA basketball player, the link is not always as direct. So the why in those cases is really important to get the buy-in. And then finally, how are we going to do this? And so that's getting into what's the approach that we're going to use today to really get the most out of this. And that's where I bring in a lot of the mental concepts. Hey, we are going to, today we're going to be working, we're going to be looking at how you are moving, how you're addressing the skills. Each of you are then going to be getting a very specific mental focus. I want you to apply that mental focus, and I'm going to be working with each of you to upgrade that. So by the time you get out of this session and over the next X number of sessions, you're going to have the exact mental trigger. You're going to have the exact state and frame of mind that ensures you get right where you need to be. So when you are under the duress, all you need to do is step into that state of mind, and decision-making comes naturally from there. Something to that effect. You can start to weave in, if you would, the mindset side of it. So why, what, and how. And then from there, at the end of the day, it's about being an engaging, interested, active coach. If I'm watching you do whatever the skill, whatever the task is, Chris, and I'm saying, hey, Chris, I noticed this. Did you feel that? Yeah, I kind of felt that. Hey, what do you think about trying this? Now check this out. If I say, Chris, you need to do this. And maybe there's a time and a place where, as an instructor, especially with a novice, I need to be very direct. Okay. But let's say I'm now working with someone who's very experienced. How can I invite you into the learning process? We know when people have a heightened sense of autonomy, contribution, and causation, that we tend to see a direct relationship to personal intrinsic motivation. And that intrinsic motivation is cashed out in you paying attention to what you are doing. So notice the difference if I say, Chris, on your next rep, do this, versus, Chris, did you notice this? Oh, yeah, I kind of did. And what did that feel like? Oh, it felt like this. What do you think about trying this on your next repetition? Yeah, let me give that a go. Okay, give that a go for the next few, and then I'm going to come back to you. Now we have a dialogue, right? That dialogue has allowed us to co-generate the next thought. You feel that you have a bit more investment, that you are a part of whatever that next thought is, and now you're excited to try it out. It's like you've been given a mental gift, and you want to open it up. You want to see what's inside. And what's inside is ultimately a sense of improvement. And if you see, well, that dialogue resulted with a sense of improvement that was cashed out in me actually being better, guess what? That's a pretty cool feeling. Dopamine rush on the back of that. Who doesn't want to continue to engage in that kind of feeling? And so in a lot of ways, this is where I think you can take the person who maybe shows up not as motivated, not as engaged, but maybe they're a product of poor coaching. Oh, not this again. I'm just going to get an earful for the next hour. It's like, okay, it doesn't mean that you're allowing people who are novices to just carve their own path through this technique or skill they're trying to learn, but you're guiding them. At the end of the day, a Sherpa doesn't carry a climber up on his or her back to the top of Everest. You still got to walk it. At the end of the day, we're not business, we're not the boss, we're a business partner. And like it or not, we're not the one engaging the skill. We're guiding from the side. And so let's make them really feel that we are a guide and not just an instructor telling them what to do.
Yeah, that is super helpful. And one follow-up question on that is, so let's say we see our people, they're struggling, they're in that strategic, what did you call it? A strategic struggle?
Strategic struggle. I think.
Yeah. I love that. Do I have your permission to rip off and duplicate that saying?
Please take it.
It's really good.
Name your next book after it. I don't mind.
There you go. But let's say, for example, I'm teaching ground fighting, and I've got some people, they're rolling on the ground, they're fighting, defeating a mount position or whatever. And I have a student that I see is in that strategic struggle space, and I'm just going to let that go for a minute because I'm seeing that they are moving towards a successful outcome. And then they actually are successful. They have the right movement solution. They defeat it. I think one of the mistakes that I made for a long time is when I saw my people be successful, I didn't step in and have that feedback, because what I realize now is I want to know, do they know why they were successful? And I just assumed that seeing success meant they knew it. So can you comment on that? Because I think often feedback is not provided. We're very good at providing feedback when we see our people needing to improve, and we provide that type of feedback. But what about engaging in a feedback loop when they are successful to cement that success?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a reinforcement or a positive feedback loop versus a negative feedback loop. And I think oftentimes, Chris, the positive and the negative feedback can actually be taken. It takes on more of the emotional meaning of the word positive versus negative. And I think in a lot of ways, the work that I'm doing is I think we can actually strip feedback from any real negative emotional context. Because the second we bring in a negative emotional context, the risk is that we lose them, that we draw their attention so heavily into this negative emotional state, we're blocking their capacity to attend and keep a positive mindset on what's next, because they're stuck in the past, basically. And if you think of it like that, it's like, well, they need to hear the negative, yes, but how? And this is why I always talk about the how versus the what, how I phrase that feedback, whether I'm phrasing feedback on what they did well or what they need to improve. I actually can still phrase that feedback in a positive orientation. So before I explain that, though, I like to answer this kind of question through what I refer to as the sippy cup principle. So a fellow coach of mine, when I was at Athletes Performance, we were sitting down one night and we had this exact conversation around feedback. And he explained it to me like this. He's like, when my son was young and I would hand him a sippy cup, he would take the sippy cup and he would pour it out. And, the dad would say, stop pouring it out. And then he would bang it on the counter. Stop banging it. Then he would shake it. Stop shaking it. Right. Then he would throw it. Stop throwing it. And inevitably he realized, son, when you're done with the sippy cup, just put it down. And that's what he did. And what he realized in that moment is, when I tell you not to do something, that's one of 1,000 other things that I could subsequently have to tell you not to do, right? There's probably 1,000,001 different things you could do wrong, but in most cases, I'm making a generalization here, there's one way to do it the right way, right? For whatever the given task is, if you're at the appropriate level of coaching. And so what he said there is, rather than telling someone, hey, in sprinting, you didn't get your leg up, or you didn't move your arms enough, or your body position isn't right, we assume wrongly that in telling them what they didn't do or what they did wrong, that they immediately have the solution. The irony is, had they had the solution, they never would have made the mistake in the first place. So the clarity that that's the wrong approach is in the approach itself. Interestingly, what I should be doing is reinforcing what I want to do. So let's say, Chris, you didn't raise your leg high enough in your sprinting to run fast. Rather than saying, hey, you didn't raise your leg high enough, I might say, Chris, on your next repetition, I want you to keep focusing on lifting your legs, or keep focusing on driving your knees forward, or even better, keep focusing on driving your knees forward as if you were hitting sparring mitts, or driving your knees forward as if you were crashing or shattering a pane of glass. So now what I've done is I've clearly established what needs to improve. I phrased it in the language of what I want them to do versus what you didn't do. And I phrased it in such a way that I actually make it task-oriented. Not only drive your knees forward as if to shatter a pane of glass. There's an analogy, very visual, has an emotional context, very easy to apply and map onto my movement on my next repetition. And so ultimately, I think that's what we need to do when we're dealing with, let's say, an error or an undesirable movement pattern or movement behavior. In your case, I am notorious for when it finally clicks, and I'm talking like the light bulb, or as they say in Ireland, the penny drops, the big click, they've got it. I will make a big frickin' deal out of that. I'll sprint, when I have guys do a 40-meter or 40-yard dash, I'd sprint across the field and frickin' bear hug them and pick them up. I'd somersault and then sprint at them. And it's part of my personality. I'm excited. I love this. But what I realized is this kind of bit of crazy Nick that comes out when things really go well actually serves this unbelievable purpose of galvanizing the moment. You make it unforgettable. But think about that word, unforgettable. If the moment is unforgettable, what happened in that moment becomes unforgettable, and it leaves them with a heightened sense of it. And so, for example, when I'm coaching my kid's soccer team or my daughter's basketball team, I have a phrase. I'm like, now that's basketball, or that's soccer, or in our case over here, that's football. And that's kind of the phrase. I don't pull it out very often, but they know when I say it, man, they really nailed something. A concept came through, and the smile on their face and a smile on my face, because we both win. We both win in that case. And that's what sport, that's what life, that's what community is all about, creating win-wins. And so that you got to celebrate it, because ultimately, to put a bow on this, doing something the right way is one way. Doing something the wrong way is one of many ways to do it wrong. And so reinforcing the positive leaves them with a very clear, echoed sense of what good is. When you tell someone that they've done something wrong, it's just one of many other flavors that can take its place. And so overemphasizing when things are done right cashes out in far better learning, in my opinion, than strictly speaking, always just going to the next error in the line.
Oh, perfect. That is super helpful. Well, we're quickly coming up on an hour already, Nick, but there's a couple of things I just want to kind of probe on a little bit here, because I took a couple of statements out of your book here that I felt were really resonated with me as a law enforcement trainer when it comes to this whole idea of how I want my people thinking when they're out there performing in the real world, when they're facing violence in those time compressed, really high consequence moments, how I want them to think. And so you said this in your book. I'll just say it and then you can expand on it, because I think it's super important. The first thing is, a classic symptom of internal cueing is a lack of transfer to the performance environment. And if there's one thing that we struggle with in law enforcement, I think it's poor transfer of the motor skill or the performance from the learning environment to the performance environments. And then you say this: use language. So as a coach, use language consistent with how you want them to be thinking during the performance. And so can you maybe, because I think there's a connection between those two things, the language that's used and the cue, and how you want your people actually thinking when the metal hits the meat in the real world.
Absolutely. So we have to recognize that there's a cascade of events that occur in the coach or the instructor-instructee dynamic, right? By the pure design and the nature that, Chris, you and I are separate beings, I need a mechanism to get what's in my head out of my head and into yours, okay? The way we humans have learned to do that, we have various mechanisms. I can demonstrate something, and in that case, you use your sight. You literally use your vision to pull in the outside to the inside. Or we can use sound. I can verbalize. So sound waves literally generate these squiggly words. You hear them, your brain interprets them, and you say, okay, I get it. Now, assuming that the language I give you is an intelligible, whether it's an internal cue or external, you understand it as spoken. That's step number one, okay? But ultimately, that language is transferred into a state of mind. It's no longer just words, is it? It leaves you with a feeling. And so let me just demonstrate this for you in the audience. If I say the words push versus punch, and I use this example in the book, push versus punch, do those words feel the same to you?
No, not at all.
No. If I again had you imagine you were running and I said push off the ground versus into the ground, does that feel the same to you?
No.
No. So language, by its very nature, is not one-dimensional. Language is whether or not we recognize it. Different words are going to leave us with a different felt sense, experienced sense of what those words mean. And inevitably, it creates a state of mind. And so what we have to understand is what we say is cashed out as in the state of mind it encourages. Another way to say state of mind is where the person places their attention. The spotlight, right, that I can put on anything, on any sense, internal or external, it's fixed. And so the cue invites them to place their attention here versus there, okay, on this versus that. And that's really important because that's now getting, ultimately, in doing that, that is going to encourage a state of mind that is echoed in a pattern of movement behavior. And so if we use my sprinting example, Chris, I gave the first cue I offered, and it's a common enough cue. People will talk about extending their knees or extending their hips when someone's running so that the leg goes back nice and straight, hits the ground hard, and boom, projects you forward to go fast. But let me ask you, Chris, is the knee the only thing involved in sprinting?
Oh, no. It's the whole
Is the
body.
hip? Exactly. It's a symphony. It's the foot, it's the ankle, it's everything. So when I cue a joint or a body part, or I invite you to go internal, I invite you to focus on one thing in the absence of all the other components that still play a role. And even though the intention behind that, Chris, is really positive, I've identified that that aspect of the body isn't quite moving I want, it's quite reductionistic. It's trying to think, well, if I just fix that area, it's somehow going to fix everything else. But if in taking attention away from the whole system, I put it on just a part of the system, I actually don't realize that there is a cost to pulling attention away from the other areas. And now I still might have a problem. I might have a bigger problem. And so let's now bring this into, let's say, firearms and working in real life. If a lot of the way I'm teaching firearms has to do, and I'm only guessing here, has to do with hand position, elbow position, shoulder position, and posture. And I am not an expert, and I'm not going to dismiss that those things are critically important and likely have a role to play in the learning of handling firearms and accuracy. But inevitably, when I am in a live fire situation, let's say, that is, to your point, that is not where I want my attention to be. So the challenge you have is, how can I teach someone, in this case, to handle a firearm in a way that still honors the mental state that allows their attention to be outward, where the information is in which I'm going to respond to skillfully? How do I do that? Ultimately, if I use an and approach where I say, hey, we need your elbows up, we need your shoulders in this position, we need your wrist in this position, I might say, to do that, I want you to imagine your entire upper body shelf is on a table. Keep it flat on a table. All of a sudden now I take that entire sequence or series of joints and muscles and I collaborate them on a very simple, non-mentally invasive thought that really is just trying to give you a visual anchor to keep everything flat. So if I imagine I literally had everything on a table, it's actually not a thought that takes thinking. It's more of a sense-making activity, move as if. And in time, that allows me to leave that reference point like the background, like background music. I know it's there, but I'm not thinking about it. Freeing up attentional resources to be, in this case, where they need to be, which is out in the real world. Let's say we're talking about aiming, right? I might be very technically oriented in how I hold a firearm, but ultimately aiming is really, really important. So ultimately, I want to bring my attention into the environment in an appropriate way that connects my body position to ultimately where that firearm needs to go and land. And so, again, that connects, that's the conductor, it connects all the parts into the oneness of the outcome I'm seeking to achieve. And so I think the biggest thing I can say, Chris, is starting internally and building an understanding of body position is really important. But I think in parallel, and I emphasize in parallel, giving people the visual analogies that can combine all these multiple components together and simplify things, really, really important. And in doing so, we free up attention to be where it needs to be, which is out in the open. The final thing I'll say on this point is this. They have actually found in examples of sprinting, examples of various other kind of reaction lights, that our reaction time is slower when we are mentally occupied by an internal cue versus an external cue that quite literally are meant to do the exact same thing. So if I have someone reacting off, let's say, a three-point stance to a starter gun in a sprint, quite literally, those that are thinking more externally will react faster. And here's why. If I give you an internal cue, I'm immediately placing a greater attentional demand on you, because you're having to think not only about the whole, because still, even if you don't think about the whole body is still involved in the task, and I have to think about the part. So if you focus on the micro, you betray the macro. But if you focus on the macro, you still respect the micro. And so it doesn't work in the other direction. So in this case, bringing in external focus frees up attentional resources, preserves reaction time, allows me to get the whole oneness of the technical change, but still, in your case, keeping their attention in the right frame of mind to do the task at hand.
That is fascinating about reaction time. And I think, again, in the law enforcement domain where those opportunities for action may only be present for milliseconds, and in fact,
Yes.
lives can be saved or lost in milliseconds, that anything we can do to help improve our perception reaction time of our officers in the field is absolutely critical.
And so, Chris, let me say this, that this is what we want. We want the cue to not leave them with a thought. We want the cue to leave them with a feeling. If I was to offer the listener one concept in how to start to judge the effectiveness of their cues, does the cue require someone to think in the way one has to intellectually think to do a math problem? Or does it allow them to feel in the same way they feel an emotional response when they watch comedy or a movie? We want the latter. We want the cue to quite literally resonate with the body and in the body. And that leaves mental resources to do secondary tasks, in this case, make those quick reaction decisions.
That's super helpful, Nick. And brother, we've been going for just over an hour already. I'm looking down at my notes. I've got 2 pages of notes of things I wanted to ask you. But the conversation has been just incredible. I want to leave you with the final word, Nick. I know that you have obviously your book, which has been so impactful to me, and I've recommended it to so many other trainers. The Language of Coaching, the Art and Science of Teaching Movement Skills, and that's published by Human Kinetics Press in 2021. But you also have other resources because you've got some great videos online, Nick, where you kind of walk through your book in very helpful ways, providing lots of examples and practical applications. Can you maybe talk about some of those resources for our audience? Where would you want them to go to find out more?
Yeah. All that's on YouTube under the Language of Coaching. In fairness, Chris, I probably haven't done as many recently, but I think the one, to your point, that I have done in the past still hold in terms of the messaging. And so I did them during the COVID window and when the book came out, to kind of be a narrative resource to go along with the various chapters in the book. And so, yeah, the Language of Coaching is where that can be found. The Language of Coaching .com, which points back to those resources, is there. I am hopeful that I'll start working on the second edition of the book and starting to add more resources to that space, both on YouTube and beyond. The goal in the future is going to be to have a course that fully covers the book and kind of the broader space of communication, coaching, and learning. And those will all be available on those resources. If you want kind of my fresh thoughts, and I can't believe I'm not the most consistent person at this, but Instagram at Nick Winkelman is probably where any fresh ideas and thoughts and sparks that inevitably will probably make their way into the second edition of the book, those kind of come fast and furious on Instagram.
That's fantastic. Well, we've been speaking with Nick Winkelman, author of The Language of Coaching, the Art and Science of Teaching Movement Skills. Nick, thank you for your time. Thanks for what you do. And we hope to have you back on the Trainer's Bullpen.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. And no doubt yourself and everyone listening, thank you for all you do to keep us safe. Thank you.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.